Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. I hope you all are doing well. You're listening to The English Globe, the podcast where we help you improve your English while learning interesting and useful information. My name is Adam, and as always, I'm here with my co-host, Julia. Julia, how are you doing today?
Hi, Adam. I'm doing great, and I hope our listeners are having a fantastic day too. It's always exciting to be here and talk about new topics that not only help with learning English, but also expand our knowledge about the world. Today's topic is really fascinating, and I think our listeners are going to love it.
Absolutely. Today, we are going to talk about the rise of America, from colony to superpower. Have you ever wondered how the United States became one of the most powerful countries in the world? Today, America is a leader in politics, economy, military strength, and technology. But it wasn't always like this. A long time ago, America was just a collection of small colonies under British rule. It had no real power, no strong government of its own, and no identity as an independent nation. But over time, through war, hard work, and smart decisions, it became one of the most influential countries in history.
That's right. The transformation of America from a colony to a global superpower is truly an incredible story. It is full of struggles, revolutions, economic growth, and big decisions that shape the modern world. America's journey to becoming a superpower teaches us many important lessons about leadership, perseverance, and development. It's also a great example of how a country can rise from humble beginnings and achieve greatness through determination and vision.
Now, you might be wondering, why are we discussing this topic in an English learning podcast? Well, there are actually many reasons. First, history is a great way to improve your English. When you listen to historical stories, you get exposed to new words, phrases, and sentence structures that you might not hear in everyday conversations. This helps you expand your vocabulary and become more confident in using English.
That's a very good point, Adam. Another reason is that understanding history helps you connect with people. When you talk to native English speakers, history is often an important part of discussions, whether in casual conversations, work meetings, or even while traveling. If you know some basic historical facts, you'll be able to participate in these conversations and express your thoughts more confidently.
Exactly. And one more reason is that history influences the language we use today. Many common phrases and expressions come from historical events. For example, have you ever heard the phrase, "no taxation without representation"? This was a famous slogan during the American Revolution when the colonists were protesting against British rule. Understanding phrases like this will not only improve your English, but also help you understand where these expressions come from.
That's so true. So, in today's episode, we are going to take you on a journey through time. We will start with the early days of America as a British colony, then move on to the American Revolution, the formation of the new government, the Civil War, and finally, how the United States became a major global power in the 20th and 21st centuries.
And don't worry, we will explain everything in a simple and easy way so you can follow along even if you are a beginner in English. We will also highlight important vocabulary words and phrases so that you can improve your English while learning about history.
That sounds perfect. So, if you're ready to learn something new and improve your English at the same time, stay with us as we dive into the incredible story of how America rose from a colony to a global superpower.
All right, let's get started. Now that we have introduced today's topic and discussed why it is important for English learners, let's go back in time, long before the United States became a powerful country. Before the land we now call the United States was even a collection of British colonies, it was home to a completely different group of people. The story of America does not begin with the British arriving on ships. It begins with the Native Americans, who had lived on this land for thousands of years.
That's a really important point, Adam. Many people think of American history starting when European explorers and settlers arrived, but in reality, there were already many different Native American tribes and nations living across the continent. These indigenous groups had their own cultures, languages, and ways of life. Some, like the Iroquois in the northeast, had advanced political systems and formed alliances with other tribes. Others, like the Cherokee in the southeast or the Sioux in the Great Plains, had their own traditions, economies, and unique ways of adapting to their environments.
Exactly. Native Americans lived in harmony with nature, relying on hunting, fishing, and farming for survival. They built homes suited to their regions. Some lived in teepees, others in longhouses, and some in pueblos made of clay bricks. They had deep spiritual beliefs, rich storytelling traditions, and a complex understanding of medicine and agriculture. But everything changed dramatically when European explorers, particularly the British, started arriving in the 1600s.
That's right. The British were not the first Europeans to come to America, but they played the biggest role in shaping what would later become the United States. In the early 1600s, British explorers and settlers began arriving on the eastern coast of North America. One of the most famous early settlements was Jamestown, which was established in 1607 in what is now Virginia. This was the first permanent English colony in America, and it marked the beginning of British control over the region.
But why did the British come to America in the first place? Well, there were several reasons. Some people came seeking economic opportunities because they hoped to find gold, silver, and other valuable resources. Others came because they wanted religious freedom. They were escaping persecution in England and wanted a place where they could practice their beliefs freely. Some were simply adventurers, willing to take the risk of traveling to an unknown land in search of a better life.
However, life in the colonies was not easy at all. The first British settlers struggled to survive. They faced harsh winters, food shortages, and conflicts with Native American tribes. Many of the early settlers were not prepared for the challenges of farming and building homes in a new environment, and as a result, many of them died from hunger and disease. But over time, the British colonies grew stronger, and more settlers arrived, bringing with them new skills and resources.
Yes, and as more British people arrived, the colonies expanded. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, there were 13 British colonies along the eastern coast of North America. Each of these colonies had its own economy, government, and culture, but they were all under British rule. The British government controlled trade, passed laws, and made decisions for the colonies. However, the people living there had their own way of life that was very different from the people in England.
That's true. The economy of the colonies was based on agriculture, trade, and natural resources. The southern colonies, such as Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, became known for their large plantations, where crops like tobacco, cotton, and rice were grown. These crops were exported to Europe, and the plantation system became a huge part of the colonial economy. However, this system relied heavily on enslaved African labor, which was a dark and tragic part of American history.
Meanwhile, in the northern colonies, the economy was quite different. The New England colonies, including Massachusetts and Rhode Island, had rocky soil that was not ideal for large farms, so people focused on fishing, shipbuilding, and trade instead. Towns and cities in the north became centers of business, where merchants, craftsmen, and traders played an important role in the economy. These northern colonies also had strong religious communities, and education was highly valued, with schools being built to teach children how to read and write.
That's an important point, because education in the colonies was quite different from today. In some places, boys were sent to school to learn basic reading, writing, and math. But in many areas, education was mostly provided at home. Wealthy families often hired private tutors for their children, while in some colonies, religious groups set up schools to teach children how to read the Bible. Girls, unfortunately, had fewer opportunities for education, as they were expected to focus on household duties instead.
Speaking of daily life, the culture of the colonies was a mix of influences from Britain, Native Americans, and other European settlers. People lived in small villages or large farms, and their social lives often revolved around churches, markets, and town meetings. Families were large, and life was centered around hard work, whether in farming, business, or skilled trades. Unlike in England, where social classes were more rigid, colonial America had a society where people could sometimes move up in status through hard work and success.
However, even though the colonies were growing and becoming more independent in their daily lives, they were still controlled by Britain. The British government expected the colonies to follow its rules, pay taxes, and support British interests. At first, many colonists accepted this system because they still saw themselves as British citizens. But as time went on, things started to change. The colonists began to feel that Britain was treating them unfairly, especially when it came to taxes and government control.
That's right. And this feeling of unfair treatment eventually led to growing tensions between Britain and the American colonists. The colonists started questioning why they had to follow laws made by a government thousands of miles away, especially when they had no representatives in the British Parliament. These frustrations and conflicts would eventually lead to something big, the American Revolution.
And that is exactly what we're going to talk about next. The story of how the American colonies decided to break away from Britain and fight for their independence is one of the most important events in history. It changed not only America, but also influenced revolutions and democratic movements around the world.
Absolutely. But before we move on to the revolution, let's do a quick recap of what we have learned so far. We started by talking about the Native Americans, who lived in America long before the British arrived. Then, we discussed how the British established colonies in North America, starting with Jamestown in 1607. We explored why people came to America, how they survived, and how different regions of the colonies developed their own economies and cultures. Finally, we touched on how tensions began to rise between the colonists and Britain, setting the stage for what would come next.
And with that, we are ready to move into the next part of our discussion: how America went from being a group of British colonies to an independent nation. So, stay with us as we continue this incredible story.
All right, let's move forward to the American Revolution.
Now that we've discussed how America was once a collection of British colonies and how these colonies developed their own economies, cultures, and ways of life, we need to talk about one of the most important turning points in world history: the American Revolution. This was not just a war. It was a movement that changed the future of the United States and influenced revolutions around the world. But before we get into the details of the war itself, we have to ask a very important question. Why did the American colonists want independence from Britain in the first place?
Exactly. This led to the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." The colonists were not just upset about the money, they were angry about the principle of the matter. They believed that if they were going to be taxed, they should have representatives in the British government who could speak on their behalf. But Britain refused to give them that right, which only increased the tension between the colonies and the British authorities. One of the first major protests against British rule happened in 1773, and it became one of the most famous events leading to the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party.
The Boston Tea Party was not just an ordinary protest. It was a bold and dramatic act of defiance against British authority. The British government had passed a law called the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company the exclusive right to sell tea in the colonies. This meant that local merchants were cut out of the business, and the colonists were forced to buy tea from British suppliers, often at higher prices. The colonists saw this as another unfair rule being imposed on them, and they decided to take action.
That's right. On December 16, 1773, a group of colonists in Boston, who called themselves the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Native Americans and secretly boarded British ships that were carrying tea. In the middle of the night, they dumped over 90,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. This act of rebellion sent a clear message to Britain. The American colonists were no longer willing to accept British control without a fight. The British government responded harshly by passing a series of laws called the Intolerable Acts, which were designed to punish the colonies, especially Massachusetts. These laws shut down Boston Harbor, restricted town meetings, and allowed British soldiers to stay in colonists' homes without permission.
This only made things worse. Instead of scaring the colonists into obedience, the British government's response actually made them angrier. People across the 13 colonies started organizing and talking about breaking away from British rule completely. Leaders from different colonies came together to form the First Continental Congress in 1774, which was the first real attempt at a united American government. They sent letters to King George III asking for fair treatment and better representation, but Britain ignored them. By 1775, tensions had reached a breaking point, and the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts.
The war had officially begun. The British had the most powerful army and navy in the world at that time, and they expected to defeat the colonists quickly. But what the British didn't realize was that the American colonists were not going to give up easily. They had a strong motivation to fight because they were defending their homes, their families, and their future. Many of them also believed that freedom was worth risking everything for. As the fighting continued, more and more people started supporting independence, and soon, the idea of completely separating from Britain became more popular.
That's when something truly historic happened. On July 4, 1776, leaders from the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia and signed one of the most important documents in history, the Declaration of Independence. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, this document officially declared that the American colonies were no longer under British rule and that they were now an independent nation. The Declaration of Independence was more than just a political statement. It was a powerful message about freedom, democracy, and human rights. It stated that all men are created equal and that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideas would later inspire many other countries to fight for their own independence.
But just declaring independence was not enough. Britain was not going to let the colonies leave without a fight, so the war continued. The American Revolution lasted from 1775 to 1783, and it was one of the most difficult wars in history because the colonists were up against the strongest military force in the world. At first, the British Army won many battles, and things looked bad for the Americans. But over time, several key factors helped America win the war.
One of the biggest advantages for the Americans was the leadership of George Washington, who was chosen to be the commander of the Continental Army. Even though Washington's army had fewer soldiers and fewer resources than the British, he used smart military strategies to keep his troops motivated and organized. He avoided major battles when necessary and focused on small surprise attacks, which helped the American forces stay strong even when they were outnumbered.
Another key factor was the help from France. After the Americans won an important battle at Saratoga in 1777, France decided to officially support the American colonies. The French provided money, weapons, soldiers, and naval support, which made a huge difference in the war. Without French assistance, the American Revolution would have been much harder to win.
One of the most decisive battles of the war was the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. By this time, American and French forces had gained the upper hand, and they surrounded the British Army in Yorktown, Virginia. After weeks of fighting, the British general, Lord Cornwallis, surrendered, marking the beginning of the end for Britain's control over the colonies. 2 years later, in 1783, the war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, in which Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation.
And just like that, America had done something that many thought was impossible. It had won its independence from one of the most powerful empires in the world. The victory of the American Revolution not only changed the future of the United States, but also influenced other countries. People in France, Latin America, and other parts of the world were inspired by the American Revolution, and many of them later fought for their own freedom.
That's right. The ideas of democracy, equality, and self-government that were written in the Declaration of Independence became some of the most important values of the modern world. The American Revolution was not just a war for land, it was a war for freedom, self-rule, and the right of people to govern themselves. Adam, what an incredible story. Now that we've talked about how America won its independence, in the next section, we will discuss what happened after the war and how the new nation built its government and economy. There were many challenges ahead, and building a new country was not easy. But America had started on its path to becoming a powerful nation. So, stay with us as we continue the journey of how America rose from a colony to a superpower.
Let's move on to the next chapter, how America built its new government and economy. Now that we've discussed how America won its independence from Britain after years of struggle, sacrifice, and war, we need to talk about what happened next. Winning independence was a huge achievement, but it was just the beginning of an even bigger challenge, building a brand new nation from the ground up. Imagine being in the shoes of the American leaders at that time. They had successfully broken away from British rule, but now they had to answer some of the most important questions. How would they govern themselves? What kind of laws should they create? Who would be in charge? These were not easy questions to answer, and the choices they made in the early years would shape the future of the United States for centuries to come. That's a great point, Adam, because even though America was free from British rule, the country was far from stable in the beginning. At first, the newly independent states tried to govern themselves under a system called the Articles of Confederation, which was the first attempt at a national government. However, this system had many problems because it gave too much power to the individual states and not enough power to the central government. The federal government had no authority to collect taxes, no national army, and no strong leadership to enforce laws. This led to many conflicts between the states, and it quickly became clear that the Articles of Confederation were not working. The new country was struggling with debt, economic instability, and disagreements about how to move forward. It was a critical moment in American history because if the leaders didn't find a solution, the country they had fought so hard to create might have fallen apart before it even had a chance to succeed.
Exactly. And that's when the country's leaders realized they needed a stronger and more effective government. In 1787, delegates from each state gathered in Philadelphia for what became known as the Constitutional Convention. Their goal was to fix the problems with the Articles of Confederation, but as they debated, they realized that a simple fix wouldn't be enough. They needed to create an entirely new system of government. Over several months of discussion, argument, and compromise, they wrote the document that would become the United States Constitution, which is still the foundation of the American government today. This was one of the most important moments in American history because the Constitution created a system that balanced power between the federal government and the states while ensuring that no single person or group had too much control. It introduced the idea of checks and balances, meaning that the government was divided into three branches: the legislative branch, which makes laws, the executive branch, which enforces laws, and the judicial branch, which interprets laws. This structure ensured that power was shared and that no one branch could become too powerful, which was a major concern after having lived under the rule of a king.
That's right. The Constitution also introduced the idea of democracy and representation, meaning that leaders would be elected by the people rather than ruling by birthright like kings and queens. One of the biggest debates during the Constitutional Convention was how states should be represented in the new government. Large states wanted representation based on population, while smaller states wanted equal representation. This led to what is known as the Great Compromise, which created a two-part legislative branch, the House of Representatives, where representation is based on population, and the Senate, where each state has an equal number of representatives. This compromise helped create a fair and balanced system that satisfied both large and small states, making it possible for them to work together as one nation.
Once the Constitution was written and approved, the next big question was, who would be the first leader of this new country? The answer was clear: George Washington. Washington was a hero of the American Revolution, and people respected him for his leadership, honesty, and dedication to the country. He was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States in 1789, and his leadership during those early years played a crucial role in shaping the new nation. Washington set many traditions and expectations for future presidents, such as the idea that the president should serve a limited number of terms and that power should be peacefully transferred from one leader to the next. These traditions became a key part of American democracy and helped prevent the country from falling into dictatorship or chaos.
Yes, and one of Washington's biggest challenges as president was keeping the country united. The new government had been created, but many people still had different opinions about how it should work. Some people, like Alexander Hamilton, believed in a strong federal government that could manage the economy and support industries, while others, like Thomas Jefferson, believed in giving more power to individual states and focusing on farming and local communities. These disagreements led to the formation of political parties, which would become a permanent part of American politics. Washington himself warned against political parties, fearing that they would divide the country, but despite his warning, political disagreements grew stronger over time.
Another major challenge for the young nation was dealing with financial problems. The American Revolution had left the country deeply in debt, and the government needed a way to raise money. To solve this problem, Alexander Hamilton, who was Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, created a financial plan that included creating a national bank, raising taxes, and establishing a system for paying off debts. His plan helped strengthen the economy, but it also created tensions between different groups of people. Many farmers and small business owners felt that the government was favoring wealthy merchants and bankers, which led to protests like the Whiskey Rebellion, where farmers in Pennsylvania revolted against new taxes on whiskey. Washington had to send troops to stop the rebellion, showing that the new government was strong enough to enforce its laws.
That's a great example of how the young United States faced many struggles in its early years. Another major issue was dealing with foreign countries. Even though America had won its independence, it was still surrounded by powerful European nations that had their own interests in North America. Britain still controlled Canada, Spain controlled Florida and much of the land in the West, and France was dealing with its own revolution. Washington had to make difficult decisions about how America should interact with other countries. One of his most famous decisions was the Neutrality Proclamation, which stated that the United States would stay out of foreign wars and focus on building its own strength. This policy of avoiding European conflicts became a major part of American foreign policy for many years.
Despite all these challenges, the United States survived its difficult early years and slowly became stronger. Washington chose to step down after 2 terms in office, setting an important precedent for future presidents. His leadership had helped establish the country's government, economy, and military, giving the young nation a solid foundation. But even though America had made it through its first few decades, there were still many struggles ahead, including westward expansion, conflicts with Native Americans, and the growing issue of slavery.
That's right. The early years of the United States were filled with struggles, but they were also a time of great progress. The country had successfully created a new government based on democracy, established leadership under George Washington, and managed to stay united despite political and economic challenges. These early decisions helped shape America's future and set the stage for its rise as a powerful nation. In the next section, we will talk about how America continued to grow, expand its territory, and face new challenges on its journey to becoming a world power.
Yes, so stay with us as we move into the next part of our discussion, how the United States expanded westward and continued its journey toward becoming a global superpower.
Now that we've talked about the birth of the United States, the creation of its government, and the challenges the country faced in its early years, we need to move forward and discuss the next major chapter in America's history: westward expansion and industrial growth. After gaining independence and establishing a strong government, the United States was ready to grow both in size and in economic power. The early leaders of the country believed that expansion was not just a possibility, but a necessity for the future of the nation. The idea that Americans had a special right to expand across the continent became known as manifest destiny, a belief that the country was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. This belief played a huge role in shaping American policies, leading to the acquisition of new territories, the movement of settlers westward, and the growth of industries that transformed the American economy. However, expansion was not always peaceful, and it brought both opportunities and conflicts that would shape the nation's future.
That's absolutely right, Adam. The westward expansion of the United States was one of the most significant events of the 19th century, and it began with major land acquisitions. The first and most important was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when President Thomas Jefferson bought a massive piece of land from France, nearly doubling the size of the country. This land stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and opened up vast new territories for settlement. Soon after, explorers like Lewis and Clark were sent on an expedition to map out the new lands, establish relations with Native American tribes, and search for routes to the Pacific Ocean. Their journey helped Americans understand the vast opportunities that lay westward, encouraging more people to move beyond the original 13 states in search of new land, wealth, and opportunities. As settlers moved westward, new territories were added, including Texas, Oregon, and California, which eventually became states. However, this expansion was not without conflict. Native American tribes were forced off their lands, leading to violent clashes, broken treaties, and forced relocations such as the infamous Trail of Tears, in which thousands of Cherokee people were forced to march westward under terrible conditions.
Exactly. And while westward expansion was changing the size and shape of America, another massive transformation was taking place: the Industrial Revolution. Before this period, most Americans lived in small farming communities, growing their own food and producing goods by hand. However, as technology advanced, the way people worked, traveled, and lived changed dramatically. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century in Britain, spread to America in the early 19th century and brought with it incredible new inventions and machines that increased production, making goods cheaper and more available. One of the most important innovations was the steam engine, which led to the development of railroads, steamboats, and factories that could produce goods faster than ever before. These new industries created jobs, led to the rise of major cities, and made America a leading economic power.
That's right. One of the biggest changes during the Industrial Revolution was the rise of factories and mass production. Instead of making goods by hand in small workshops, factories began using machines to produce textiles, tools, and other products at a much faster rate. This meant that goods became cheaper and more accessible to the average person. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia grew rapidly as thousands of people moved from rural areas to find work in factories. The cotton industry became one of the most profitable industries in the country, especially in the South, where enslaved people were forced to work on cotton plantations to supply raw materials for textile factories in the North. This growing economy made America wealthier, but it also deepened the divide between the North and the South, as the Southern economy depended on slavery while the North moved toward industrialization and wage labor.
Yes, and one of the most important inventions of this period was the cotton gin, created by Eli Whitney in 1793. This machine made it much easier to separate cotton fibers from the seeds, allowing cotton to be processed faster and in larger quantities. While this invention helped boost the economy, It also led to an increase in slavery because plantation owners needed more enslaved laborers to grow and harvest cotton to keep up with the rising demand. At the same time, in the North, industries were booming, and new forms of transportation, such as railroads and canals, were being built to connect different parts of the country. The Erie Canal, for example, allowed goods to be transported more easily from the Midwest to the East Coast, helping businesses grow and encouraging more people to move westward. The introduction of steam-powered locomotives made travel faster and more efficient, allowing goods and people to move across the country in ways that were impossible before.
And along with economic growth, there was also a major change in how people lived. Cities became more crowded as immigrants from Europe arrived in search of jobs and a better life. Many people, especially Irish and German immigrants, came to America during the 19th century, escaping poverty and political troubles in their home countries. However, life in the cities was not always easy. Many workers lived in overcrowded tenement buildings, worked long hours in dangerous factories, and earned very little money. This led to the rise of labor movements, where workers began demanding better wages, safer working conditions, and shorter work days. Over time, these movements helped improve workers' rights, leading to labor laws that protected employees.
Yes, the Industrial Revolution and westward expansion were driving forces behind America's transformation from a small, newly independent country into a major economic and political power. The combination of new technologies, mass production, and expanded territories helped shape the modern United States. However, these changes also brought deep conflicts between industrial and agricultural economies, between free and enslaved labor, and between settlers and Native American tribes. These tensions would continue to grow and eventually lead to one of the darkest periods in American history, the Civil War. But before we get to that, we need to discuss how America's growth in wealth and industry also led to the rise of new social movements, innovations, and changes in the way people thought about democracy, equality, and human rights.
Absolutely. The period of expansion and industrialization was an exciting time, full of growth and opportunity, but it also raised difficult questions about justice, labor, and the treatment of different groups of people. In the next part of our discussion, we'll explore how these changes led to reform movements, debates over slavery, and the fight for civil rights that would shape the next chapter in America's history.
That's right. So stay with us as we move forward in our journey through America's rise to power and explore the events that would eventually lead to one of the most defining conflicts in U.S. history, the Civil War. Now that we've covered the expansion and industrial growth of the United States, we come to a period in history that would change the nation forever. After decades of growth, progress, and sometimes conflict, the United States found itself torn apart by a brutal and bloody war, the Civil War. The Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, is one of the most significant events in American history, and it is a key moment when the country had to confront its deepest divisions. To understand why this war happened, we must look at the complex issues that had been building for decades, especially slavery, state rights, and the growing divide between the industrial North and the agricultural South. These issues didn't just arise overnight. They were the result of long-standing political, social, and economic tensions that had reached a breaking point by the mid-19th century. The conflict was about much more than just the existence of slavery, though that was undoubtedly the central issue. It was also about how the country would grow, what kind of nation it would be, and who would have power over its future.
Exactly, Adam. The Civil War didn't happen in a vacuum. By the 1860s, the country had already been deeply divided for many years. The North, which was largely industrial and had moved away from slavery, believed in a stronger federal government that could regulate trade, industry, and even social policies. The South, on the other hand, was primarily agricultural and relied heavily on slavery to support its economy, especially in the cotton industry. As the country expanded westward, the question of whether new states and territories should allow slavery became a critical issue. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 were all attempts to find a balance between free and slave states, but they were only temporary solutions. These compromises failed to address the underlying problem, and tensions continued to rise. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 was the final straw for many Southern states. Lincoln was opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories, and his election led to the secession of 11 Southern states that formed their own government, the Confederacy, with Jefferson Davis as their president. This ultimately led to the start of the war.
Yes, and once the war began, it quickly became clear that this wasn't just a conflict about political power. It was a battle for the very soul of the nation. The Confederacy, which fought to preserve slavery and the way of life it depended on, clashed with the Union, which was fighting not only to preserve the United States as one nation, but also to put an end to the institution of slavery once and for all. The war was long and brutal, with massive battles fought at places like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh, leading to high casualties on both sides. Over 600,000 people died in this war, making it the deadliest conflict in American history. But despite the immense loss and destruction, the war also led to profound changes that would shape the country's future, particularly the end of slavery and the eventual rebuilding of the nation in what became known as Reconstruction.
Absolutely, Adam. The end of slavery was one of the most important consequences of the Civil War. The war culminated in the Emancipation Proclamation, an executive order issued by President Lincoln in 1863 that declared all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free. While the proclamation didn't immediately free all enslaved people, it changed the nature of the war and made the abolition of slavery a central goal of the Union's war effort. Later, after the Union's victory, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1865, officially abolishing slavery throughout the United States. This was a monumental step toward ensuring freedom and equality for African Americans, although the struggle for civil rights was far from over. The end of slavery didn't automatically grant equal rights, and African Americans continued to face discrimination, segregation, and violence for many years after the war.
Exactly. While the end of slavery was a huge victory, the next challenge was rebuilding the nation, physically, economically, and politically. The process of rebuilding the Southern states and reintegrating them into the Union was called Reconstruction, and it was a complex and often contentious period. From 1865 to 1877, the U.S. government worked to rebuild the South and extend civil rights to former slaves. Congress passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States and protected the voting rights of African American men. Despite these legal advancements, many Southern states passed laws known as Black Codes that severely restricted the freedoms of African Americans, leading to the rise of segregation and Jim Crow laws in the South. While Reconstruction was initially successful in passing key civil rights laws, it ultimately faced fierce resistance from Southern white supremacists, and the North's resolve to enforce these laws weakened over time. By the late 1870s, Reconstruction ended, and the South was left to struggle with the legacy of slavery and racial inequality.
The post-war period was difficult for everyone, Adam, and it's important to understand the lasting effects of the Civil War. The South was left devastated by the war, with cities, farms, and infrastructure destroyed. Many Southern families were left in poverty, and the economic structure of the South was forever altered. The reliance on slavery had created an economy based on cheap labor, and with slavery abolished, the South had to find new ways to rebuild its economy. On the other hand, the North had emerged from the war economically stronger. The Industrial Revolution had continued to expand in the North, and the war had led to the creation of many new factories and industries. With the end of the war, the North's economy boomed, while the South struggled to recover. This divide between the North and South persisted for many years, creating tensions that would continue to affect American society.
Yes, the legacy of the Civil War was far-reaching. The war didn't just shape the physical landscape of the country, but it also reshaped the social and political fabric of the United States. The Civil War proved that the United States was willing to fight to preserve its union and principles, even at a great cost. The nation emerged from the war with a stronger sense of national identity and a commitment to the idea that no state could break away from the Union without consequences. The end of slavery was a victory for freedom and human dignity, but it also exposed the deep divisions in American society that would take many more decades to heal.
That's right, Adam. The Civil War marked the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward true equality for all Americans. It forced the country to confront the injustices of slavery and begin the process of healing from the wounds that had been inflicted over centuries. The war itself may have ended in 1865, but the effects of the Civil War, including its fight for freedom, equality, and justice, continued to shape the country for years to come. The Civil War ultimately laid the groundwork for the social movements of the 20th century, such as the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, where Americans continued the fight for racial equality and justice.
Absolutely, Julia. It's clear that the Civil War was not just a war between two regions. It was a war that defined the future of the United States. The challenges faced during the Reconstruction period, the attempts to rebuild the South, and the ongoing struggle for racial equality all contributed to shaping the path forward for America. Despite the obstacles, America moved forward with a new understanding of its values and the determination to live up to its ideals of liberty and equality for all its citizens. In the next part of our podcast, we'll discuss how, even after the Civil War, America continued to evolve, leading to the economic and social changes of the 20th century that shaped the nation into a global superpower.
Absolutely, Adam. So stay with us as we move on to the next chapter of America's incredible journey. How it became the industrial powerhouse and global superpower we know today.
Now that we've discussed the challenges of the Civil War and the nation's slow yet steady recovery during the Reconstruction period, we find ourselves in a time when America, despite all its difficulties, begins to emerge as a global power. But the journey to becoming the dominant world superpower we know today wasn't smooth or easy. It took 2 world wars, profound technological advancements, and sweeping economic changes that reshaped not only the country, but the entire world. The 20th century saw America grow in influence and power, shifting from a recovering nation after the Civil War into a leading economic and military force, eventually becoming the superpower we recognize today. The wars and the massive technological, social, and economic changes that accompanied them played a pivotal role in that transformation, helping America cement its place as a global leader. So, let's start by looking at how the world wars played a significant role in shaping America's rise.
That's absolutely right, Adam. It's often said that World War I and World War II were the events that catapulted America into the global spotlight, and it's hard to disagree with that. In the early years of the 20th century, America was still relatively isolated from European conflicts. However, by the time World War I broke out in 1914, America's growing industrial and economic strength made it a major player on the world stage. Although America initially sought to stay out of the conflict, it eventually entered the war in 1917 after a series of events such as the German sinking of American ships and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, which proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico against the United States. America's entry into the war, though late, was a game-changer. The American military and industrial might helped the Allies secure victory, and America emerged from the war as one of the leading global powers. After the war, America played a key role in establishing the League of Nations and shaping the Treaty of Versailles, although, notably, America did not join the League.
Exactly, Julia. World War I marked a turning point for the United States, but it was World War II that truly transformed America into a global superpower. After the devastation of the Great Depression in the 1930s, the world was once again plunged into war with the rise of fascism in Europe and militarism in Japan. The United States initially tried to remain neutral, but after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan in 1941, America was thrust into the conflict. This time, America's involvement in the war was total. The United States became the arsenal of democracy, supplying both its own military and that of its allies with weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The U.S. economy, which had been struggling during the Great Depression, was quickly revitalized by the war effort, and millions of Americans were employed in factories producing war materials.
And the impact of World War II on America cannot be overstated. By the time the war ended in 1945, the United States had played a critical role in defeating the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and had emerged as one of the two remaining superpowers on Earth, alongside the Soviet Union. But it wasn't just about military victory. It was also about technological and scientific progress. During the war, there were huge advancements in technology, medicine, and industry, including the development of nuclear weapons. The US dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing a swift end to the war and demonstrating the immense power of the United States. The post-war world was forever changed, and the US was at the center of it all, leading efforts to establish the United Nations, creating global institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, and helping to shape a new world order.
Yes, Julia, and this period in American history was pivotal for shaping the country's role in the world. The Cold War soon followed, a decades-long standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. Even though World War II had ended, tensions between the two superpowers escalated into a global ideological conflict between capitalism, led by the United States, and communism, led by the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the United States worked to contain the spread of communism, engaging in various military and political conflicts around the world, such as the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and numerous proxy wars in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The Cold War also led to intense competition in space exploration, with the US and the Soviet Union vying to dominate the space race. The most famous moment in this race came in 1969, when the United States successfully landed astronauts on the Moon with the Apollo 11 mission, marking a major achievement in human history.
That's right, Adam. Despite the tensions of the Cold War, America emerged as the winner of this ideological battle by the end of the 1980s. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991, leaving the United States as the sole global superpower. And during this time, America's economy was booming. The post-war economic boom led to the rise of a consumer-driven society. The United States became the largest and most powerful economy in the world, driven by technological innovations, increased productivity, and the growth of global trade. In the decades following World War II, America also became a global leader in technology, with companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Google leading the world in innovation. The rise of the Internet, in particular, transformed not just the American economy, but the entire world, making the US the center of the information revolution. The emergence of the digital age fundamentally reshaped communication, business, and society, propelling America even further into the spotlight.
And let's not forget the rise of America's military power. The United States maintained a significant military presence around the world through its numerous military bases and alliances like NATO. It became the world's leading military force, with a budget that dwarfed that of any other nation. The Gulf War in 1991 was another example of America's dominance on the world stage, as U.S. forces led a coalition to quickly defeat Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the U.S. continued to wield its influence, from humanitarian aid to peacekeeping missions, to leading the charge in the fight against global terrorism following the 9/11 attacks.
Yes, and despite the challenges the US has faced, such as the 2008 financial crisis and the rise of new global competitors like China, America's position as a global superpower has remained largely intact. The country's military power, technological innovation, and economic strength continue to shape the world in ways that few other countries can match. Even today, America's influence extends far beyond its borders, as it plays a key role in international diplomacy, trade, and global governance. The rise of Silicon Valley and the continued leadership of American tech companies have allowed the US to maintain a dominant position in the digital economy, shaping everything from entertainment and communication to the future of artificial intelligence.
Absolutely, Julia. As we look at America today, it's clear that the country has not just risen to become a global power, but has defined what it means to be a superpower in the modern world. From its military might to its technological innovations and its leadership in international affairs, the United States has played a central role in shaping the 20th and 21st centuries. However, like any superpower, it faces ongoing challenges, from economic inequality to political division, climate change, and its place in a rapidly changing global order. Despite these challenges, America's continued progress, innovation, and influence make it clear that the nation remains at the forefront of the world's stage.
That's right, Adam. And as we look to the future, we can only wonder what the next chapters in America's journey will bring. With emerging global challenges and new technological frontiers to explore, America's role as a superpower will continue to evolve. One thing is certain: America's journey from its humble beginnings to its status as a global leader has been remarkable, and its impact on the world will continue to be felt for generations to come.
Absolutely, Julia. This has been an incredible journey through the rise of America as a global power. In our next episode, we'll dive deeper into the current challenges America faces and explore what the future might hold for this great nation. So, as we come to the end of today's discussion, let's quickly recap the key points we've covered. From the very beginning, we explored how America started as a collection of British colonies in the 1600s and faced many challenges throughout its history, such as wars, struggles for independence, and internal divisions. We traced the journey of the American people from their fight for independence during the American Revolution, through the creation of the nation's Constitution and the establishment of a new government. We discussed how America expanded westward, how the Industrial Revolution shaped the country's economy, and how it grew into a military and economic powerhouse. We also talked about the Civil War and its aftermath, the country's rise to global power during the World Wars, and the technological and economic developments that solidified America's position as a superpower today.
Yes, Adam. And what's fascinating about all of this is how America, despite all of its obstacles and challenges, managed to overcome them and evolve into the nation it is today. We saw the development of the US Constitution, the growth of democracy, the expansion of territory, the industrialization of the economy, and the rise of the US military as a key global force. And as we've discussed, the world wars were truly turning points, pushing America onto the global stage and setting the foundation for the technological, economic, and military dominance that the nation continues to enjoy today. From its humble beginnings as a group of colonies to its current position as a global superpower, the United States has certainly come a long way.
Exactly, Julia. It's clear that the path to becoming a superpower wasn't easy, but America's ability to adapt, innovate, and push through challenges has been key to its rise. Even today, as we face a rapidly changing world, America's influence continues to shape global politics, economics, and culture. As learners of English, understanding America's history and its position in the world can give you valuable insight into not just the language, but also the culture, the global influence, and the forces that continue to shape our future.
Absolutely, Adam. I think it's important for our students to realize that learning English isn't just about mastering the language. It's also about understanding the history, the culture, and the role of countries like the United States in shaping the world as we know it. By learning about the past, you can better understand the present and be more prepared for the future. So, I encourage all of our students to reflect on what we've discussed today. Think about how America's journey from a colony to a superpower has impacted the world and how it might continue to shape the future.
Well said, Julia. Now, as we wrap up today's episode, we want to hear from all of you. What are your thoughts on America's rise as a superpower? Do you think there are lessons to be learned from America's history that could be applied to other nations or even your own personal journey? We'd love for you to share your thoughts with us, whether it's in the comments or on social media. Learning history is an essential part of growing your understanding of the world, and we hope today's podcast has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to keep learning, not just about history, but also about the world we live in.
We truly believe that sharing thoughts and discussing topics like these is a great way to not only improve your English, but also broaden your horizons. History is full of incredible stories, and America's journey is just one of many. So, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep engaging with the world around you. Remember, learning English isn't just about words. It's about understanding the stories, the culture, and the lessons that come with them.
Well said, Julia. So that's all for today's episode. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the history of America and its rise to global power. Don't forget to share your thoughts with us, and be sure to join us for our next episode, where we'll continue exploring more important topics. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the English Globe.
Take care, everyone, and happy learning.